everybody, to the Parrot Stars podcast. I am Alexis Highland. I'm the manager at Parrot Stars, and I'm here today with Avery, who also works with me at Parrot Stars.
Hello.
We've got the dogs walking around. Oh, man.
There's Jack.
And we had Jack,
Yeah.
my blue-headed Pionis.
It's all right.
But he took a very fast and abrupt exit out of the podcast. So that's
right.
okay. More power to him.
Typical.
Okay, so today we want to talk about biting. So biting is something that comes up all the time at Parrot Stars.
Right.
And of course, it's a topic that we want to address relatively early in our podcast because it's a point of conversation, I think, among basically all parrot owners.
Right.
But our goal is to kind of open up people's perspectives and point of views around biting to help them better understand why it might be occurring or why they're experiencing bitey behaviors, and hopefully help them move to a point where biting just hopefully becomes like a non-issue, that it's something that they don't even have to worry about altogether.
Right. In theory, you should never be getting bit.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, mistakes happen.
Right.
And that's it is an unrealistic thing to expect,
Right.
of course. But it is very preventable.
Mm-hmm.
And it is one of the number one things and why we, drop everything we're doing and spend so much time with certain customers, because they come in and say, my bird just bites me all the time.
Yep.
I just deal with it. Or like they say, like, oh, every time so-and-so comes in, it goes straight to him and just bites him.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about it a little bit, and because that shouldn't really be too big of an issue.
Yeah.
But I think to start with for biting, we have to take it kind of way back to just what parrots kind of are. And it's really important. And we also reiterate this constantly, especially during our send homes that we do with customers that are first getting birds, is that people have to remember these are not a dog that is a predator that have, been turned from a wolf into what, something that we want. These dogs are predators, cats are predators.
Yep.
Most pets, a lot of the pets that people have are predators. Parrots are the opposite.
Yeah.
They are prey animals in the wild. I mean, they're always on the lookout for things that can just snatch them right up.
Yep.
I mean, so that's the first thing to always remember about your bird, is you can't just expect your bird to, what am I trying to say? Just be cool in every situation, basically, to put
They're going to be always
simply.
heightened and always have that prey instinct to kind of fear everything around it.
Yeah.
And it's a survival technique, and it works extremely well for them in the wild. So this is something that's been developing over millions of years within each species as a way to better survive the environment that they're in. And a lot of parrots come from really tumultuous, very high stakes environments where there's tons of competition for food and habitat. And if they didn't have that intense prey instinct to evade predators or always have their guard up, they wouldn't be successful in the wild. And if you don't take into consideration that that's such a huge component of your parrot's natural behaviors, it makes it really difficult to understand why they're behaving the way that they do in captivity.
Right.
But when you can take a step back and kind of see your parrot for what it is, like a very fearful, instinctual animal that has a lot of predation risk in the wild, you can kind of start to open up your mind a little bit and realize, okay, it's not personal that my bird is nervous.
Right.
It's not that I'm overtly doing probably something wrong. Maybe in certain situations, which I think we'll talk about, there may be triggers that are causing a bird to bite out of fear or whatever stressor it is. But most of the time, if they're exhibiting nervous behaviors, it's simply because it's their instinct to always be on guard.
Right. And it does sound harsh when we say parrots are always in a state of fear. Get over it. Like it's just going to, but it's true.
It's a real thing.
It doesn't matter if it's a baby bird. It doesn't matter if it's your 45-year-old, eclectus or cockatoo.
Mm-hmm.
Just one little thing that maybe we might not even notice in the
Right.
environment, something outside, in another room,
Right.
even on the TV, it could just spook them right
Yep.
there. And then, you got a situation on your hands.
Yep.
So it's just always important to be proactive about those type of things.
Yeah. And I think our goal with this podcast, sorry, the dogs are going.
Yeah, little bingo.
They're all like begging for pets and scratches right now. Something that I think people struggle with understanding their parrot's behavior or why they might be getting bit is because they do behave so unpredictably sometimes.
Right.
And I think, again, it's just that unpredictable instinct is not something that people need to over evaluate, because just like you're saying, there's a million things that might evoke a little bit of stress in your parrot.
Right.
Might not result in a full-blown bite or the bird just panicking, but it might be just enough for them to get a little bit heightened, to get them a little bit nervous. And then the predictability of the situation you're in is going to change. So just being really observant of all of those little things that might be going on around the parrot is really important. I think the other thing that I want to go back to that you mentioned is that when we think about dogs and cats in pet situations, they're domesticated over thousands of years.
Right.
So we've actively bred into them traits that are favorable for companionship. So we've sought out trainability and calmness and touch and all of these elements of cat and dog behaviors that we've like really come to like accept as just part of dog and cat ownership.
Yeah.
It's a result of hundreds and thousands of years of people like purposefully choosing dogs that were more calm, that were more trainable and more receptive to eye contact and body language.
Yeah.
And if maybe you're really familiar with that element of pet ownership, you're like, oh, obviously, like that's common sense. But not everybody realizes like how much domestication has gone into taking a wolf and feral cats and bringing them into domestic, what we see like normal breeds today. So because of that, they still are predators at their core, cats and dogs.
Yeah.
So they still have their own sets of triggers and responses to different stimulus.
Of course.
But their overall innate confidence now, assuming they haven't undergone any traumas, like typically the innate confidence level of a dog and cat is significantly higher than a parrot's is going to be, because they don't have this instinct of always having to watch their back in fear of getting eaten as part of their survival. It's just not something that's a part of their evolution. So we use the cat and dog comparison a lot, which I think in a lot of ways is really beneficial because so many people can relate to it and understand it. But we want to really make that clear divide that dogs and cats are domesticated, parrots are not. And so even though every single baby that we have at Parrot Stars, and hopefully any baby you come across in the US is going to be captive raised.
Of course.
And it's tricky because I want to make the distinction that when we say something is domesticated, we're referring to like the thoughtful breeding over long periods of time. But it's hard too because like we also refer to like things as being domestic, like as in they're domestic to the United States, like domestic beer. But yes, so you might hear things like that word contradict each other because yes, they've been raised domestically as in they've been raised within the United States, but does not mean they're domesticated.
Right. There's a difference.
Yeah. But even with parrot breeding, for those, and maybe again, this is something, if you're really deep into parrot ownership, you might know this, but for people who don't know, parrot breeding takes a long time. So with dogs and cats, they're of breeding age quite rapidly. So you can pull out traits in one human lifetime. Like you can go through generations of dogs in one human lifetime. With parrots, if even if you started breeding birds in your 20s, certain species take anywhere from 3 years to sometimes 10 to 12 years to become breeding age.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily impossible, but it's not really realistic that somebody's going to feasibly breed parrots to have particular traits.
Right. Yeah.
More or less, they're breeding for maybe color mutations or
Of course.
maybe some personality stuff if you're like looking at cockatiels or parakeets or lovebirds that have a little bit faster reproduction age. But for the most part, like because of just the time it takes them to become sexually mature, like you can't really domesticate them.
Right.
So their genetics are
What you would find.
almost identical to what you'd find in the wild.
Yeah.
So even though they've never been exposed to like a natural habitat, their evolutionary instincts or the instincts that are part of their genetics
like what they are
going to be exactly the same.
So yeah, what you see in our store is what you'll see, where they're originally from. You won't find Bingo, the Chihuahua, out in the wild somewhere.
Exactly.
So that's just what we're kind of talking about, because it is important for people, especially that aren't really far into it, is that these are not animals that just you'll take home and will jump on you and cuddle you and lick you and, rough around in the backyard.
Yep.
That's not something that you'll do with parrots. And so that's kind of the basis and a good understanding of how to prevent there's certain like behaviors of potential biting by self actions. Maybe not so much with the parrot, because if you are working on yourself, hopefully any potential biting in the future, which we'll dive into, it can be avoided.
Yeah.
So to start with biting, like what we were saying, so many people come in, say, I get bit all the time. I just let it happen.
They've accepted it.
Right. And that's a whole nother topic. But there's always an outside stimulus that usually causes the bird to potentially bite. Parrots almost never, and based off personal experience, never will bite out of aggression. They won't just get off their perch, run over there, and just
bite for no
like
reason.
Get you as hard as they can, and then laugh about it as they're walking away. That's not how parrots. That's not how they work.
Yeah, and now people might interpret it as that, but I think
it's easy to take it personally.
Exactly. Yeah.
And like what we were saying with this whole domestication talk is a lot of these stimulus is not like what we were saying. It's not personal. It's easy to make it personal because you love this animal. These animals are part of your family. Like, if one of your family members came over and hit you, you'd be like, what the heck?
Yeah.
But with parrots, there's always so many things going on that you just have to be aware of for that biting.
Yeah. And I think we're taking a wild, more or less a genetically wild animal and completely modifying its entire situation. So we're working together as like a parrot community to better understand parrots in captivity, because this is so drastically different than the lifestyle they'd be living in the wild.
Right.
Where they'd have, good, bad, or otherwise, like the freedom to escape a situation that's making them nervous.
Yes.
So in the wild, when they have so much room to move, and they're living in a flock dynamic most of their time, they rely on the response and protection of their flock, and they rely on their flight to allow them to escape a scary situation.
Right.
So I think what you're describing, if like a parrot does come over and bites somebody, quote unquote, unexpectedly, or the person's having trouble understanding why that's happening, I guess our goal here, me and you, is to kind of encourage people like not to take it personal or to get disappointed if that happens, because the situation the parrot's in is so different than what they'd be able to do in the wild in a situation that's making them stressful.
Right.
So hopefully, and like we'll talk about this in future episodes, hopefully the parrot you have is fully flighted, so that if it undergoes any sort of stressor, it has the option to fly away rather than to hunker down and bite.
Fight. Yeah.
Yes. Now, the other part of that is some people have multiple parrot households and others don't. I think the likelihood that somebody's got multiples of the same species living in a kind of free form environment is highly unlikely as in the pet world. Maybe you have multiple species living together in the same household, and maybe they're to a point where they can communicate and interact freely. But again, I don't think that's the average experience for a bird owner. So when they don't have that flock to rely on for communication and for protection, again, they're in an even more heightened state. So not to say that, I mean, we'll talk about this in future episodes. There's pros and cons, I think, to having multiple birds in the household that we really want people to consider. And I'm not, that's not the goal of today's talk, to like weigh the pros and cons of having more than one bird in the household. But if you only have one or two parrots in the house, or they're not really living in a flock dynamic, maybe they're caged individually. Again, you can't take it personal if your bird behaves in a way that you might not be able to understand, because it's so different than what they'd be experiencing in the wild.
Yeah. So to put it, simply, birds do kind of use their beak on each other. That's a way of their communication.
Yep.
So what you were saying about the flock is birds will do that to each other, and we don't understand, but I'm sure they do in a way that we can't comprehend.
Yep.
And so that's just a way of communication a lot of the times. And so it's good to recognize that.
Yep.
But just to reel in also the topic of fight or flight. I mean, it's what almost everything.
Yeah, everyone's heard it.
Everything has a fight or flight instinct. But the parrots is usually flight. And like what you were also saying with the wing clippings is people who do clip their birds' wings, why we encourage not to do that is because you are taking away that whole half of the flight or fight instinct. And so if a bird loses its main form of self-defense beyond its beak in the wild, which if it's close enough to the predator to have to use its beak, it might not go over too well.
Yeah.
So their wings are their number one way of confidence to safely get away from any situation.
Yep.
And if you do take that away, you tend to have a bird that seems a little more hesitant in their environment, a little more recluse, and you could result in more of a biting behavior because that is all the bird has to do if it does get scared. It's just hunker down and like just get you.
Yeah.
So it's an important topic. Of course, it is controversial, but it's safe to say we're very adamant about keeping our birds
them fully flighted. Absolutely.
Because these are birds. That's what they do.
And in full transparency, like, because we want this whole podcast to be very honest, and the whole platform that we kind of present ourselves at Parrot Stars is like, this has been a learning process for us, just as it has been for our customers.
Yeah.
And when we first opened, we did trim the parrot's wings. And we have customers that still come to the store that I think, fortunately, we've kind of gotten to a point where they've moved away from the wing trims. But like when we sold them the bird, its wings were trimmed.
Right.
And although we always did like incredibly mild wing trims, 7 years ago when we started, like that was what people did. Now, there were a lot of progressive people out there that I was very grateful to come across and learn from, to realize like that wasn't the best option, but that's what we were doing. And hands down, like the customer experience and my personal experience is that when we made the decision to finally stop the wing trimming, that was about 3-ish years ago, the number of nips and bites that I was getting and the number of bites the customers were getting, like, basically dropped off almost completely.
Yeah.
And even though, like, I pride myself in my ability to kind of like not push the birds to a point where they're totally stressed, and I try to have like more or less a hands-off mentality, like there were still situations where I had to take a bird out of a cage and try to interact with it. And when its wings were clipped, it was so stressed out. Like, it was so nervous. And it's just like what you said. It almost felt like we were cornering the bird, and it had no other option but to like lunge to try to get us to back off. Whereas now the experience at our store is so different.
Yeah.
Like, it's so refreshing because, like, one, we're not getting bit all the time, but
Right.
two, just seeing the change in how the birds are acting, like, they're more playful and they're more outgoing, and they just aren't in positions, like, physically, because they're able to fly away from us if they're nervous, where they're feeling that they need to bite. And I think the biggest thing that I've seen is that because they're allowed to fly, when they do come to us to take the treat, because again, we're trying to do some positive reinforcement with them, like we're trying to explain to people the benefits of having them fly to them. They're choosing to fly with us, and they know full well that if they get nervous, they can fly away. So, like, there isn't a situation where the parrot has to bite because it has full autonomy throughout the entire situation. It just is never going to be put in a position where it's feeling cornered and it's having a choice to come and take the treat from us. And so it's been kind of nice seeing that huge, huge change from where we started to where we are now, where it's just more or less like, and again, we're not judging people, but like for us, biting has kind of become almost a non-issue.
Yeah.
Like it really has.
And I think that's a good segue into what we preach.
Mm-hmm.
We go over these in depth with all of our customers or anybody that asks. Is we've tried our best to narrow it down to some main reasons why you would experience a bite in a household setting. One, naturally, common sense probably, is the bird is simply terrified.
Yeah.
If the bird is in a situation, and we say this happens a lot when the bird does first get home, because it's a very stressful transition for the bird. Hopefully the most, that's a better
The
way
only
to put
stress.
hopefully the only stressful thing that the bird has to go through. Right. But being terrified, and especially if the bird's in its enclosure, where we say to keep the bird for as long as you can. We've talked about this in previous episodes. But if the bird does feel stressed, if it does feel terrified because the new environment, and for whatever reason you have your hands right in the area of the bird, maybe you're just not, I don't know what it is, but you might experience a bite because the bird is simply just wants to get out of the situation,
it's
but
scared.
feels cornered, like what we were saying. Two, the bird is simply hungry.
Yeah.
It's a big transition from being terrified to just being hungry. But a lot of people do experience bites, and hungry is one of those situations where people might experience a bite for, in quotes, no reason.
Yeah. And I think even going back to like the fear thing, because I think kind of to elaborate on that will kind of bring us to the hunger part.
Right.
And we've talked about it in past episodes, like you mentioned, like the advantages of bringing a new bird home, or if you're trying to restart your relationship with your parrot, the advantages of keeping it within its enclosure. Again, assuming it's the right size enclosure and it's a big cage, plenty of perching, dynamic toys, good diet. We're making those assumptions. The advantages of leaving the bird in the cage is that it has an intense sense of security within the cage.
Right.
And when you're trying to start the relationship with it, you can create a more predictable environment with keeping it caged. But humans are what we are, and people have often spent a lot of money on the parrot. They're extremely excited. There's a lot of emotion that goes into it. And again, this isn't coming from a place of judgment. It's coming from just pure advice and experience.
Experience.
Like, leave it in its cage when you first get it home.
Right.
Like, there's so much advantage to trying to start your relationship with the positive reinforcement training and getting it to take treats and teaching it how to step up within the cage. Because when you let the parrot out prematurely, that is going to be the time where you're most likely to experience a bite.
Right.
Because hopefully it's fully flighted. And if you let it out prematurely before you've kind of built the trust and the relationship, it's going to bolt out the door and it's going to fly around the
It's gonna be
house.
chaos.
And
Yeah.
you're going to have to most likely restrain it in order to get it back in the cage. Or you have to leave it out and hope that it goes back into its cage on its own, which is
doesn't really happen.
really unrealistic. Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're mentioning. Like there's times where you may have to restrain a parrot in order to move it from place to place.
But
if you don't want to get bit,
it's
like
preventable.
it's preventable.
Yeah.
We don't need to let them out prematurely. This is a parrot that could live a very, very long time. Investing the first 1 to 3 months, getting it accustomed to stepping up within the controlled
Right.
environment of the cage is really going to help avoid the situation that you might be forced to put yourself in if you let it out prematurely. Now, this is the tricky part about what we do at Parrot Stars. Because, yes, most of like the green cheeks, the parrotlets, the cockatiels, they're going to go home and be pretty flighty.
Right.
And they're going to, people are going to see that in them faster.
Right.
Now, some of our more medium-sized parrots, they might go home and be very outgoing.
Yeah.
And very relaxed. And because they take longer to hand feed, and because part of what we pride ourselves in, like we're working on making them confident and we want them to be brave and not super fearful. That's the point of why we're doing all of this, is to raise happy, healthy babies. So I think sometimes when people go home with parrots that are more outgoing right off the bat or have very controlled flight and they're not panicky, they might be more tempted to take the bird out prematurely.
Right away.
And then to your point about hunger, leave it out for way too long.
And that's actually, there's Sun Conure just went home yesterday. And well, whenever you're listening to this podcast, but anyways, but the Sun Conure was so outgoing.
Yes.
Just a little bit older than the babies, but I mean, grand scheme of things, not at all much different. So outgoing, stepping up willy-nilly. I mean, taking treats like it was her day job.
Yep.
But in stress, it was like, you still have to, take the time now. You can't just let her out
and have it be
just
free for all, kind of like open door policy.
Yeah. And just to dwell before we do get on hunger, because that's the next big one. Just for a practical sense, an actual physical sense, is with the terrified behavior, which could result in a bite, is the invasion of personal space. Even if you've had so much time with your bird, you're very comfortable with your bird, and vice versa, it just, you never want to like spook a bird, especially when you're right there. And a lot of times, and why we stress so much at the store, is please don't touch the birds.
Don't touch them. Yes.
Don't touch the birds. If you want to touch the bird, just please come talk to us. But don't stick your fingers inside of a parrot's enclosure. That is their space, and you are a stranger to them. And if you invade their personal space, just like how we don't want people to stick their fingers in our face.
Yep.
You're putting yourself in a situation to get bit.
Yep.
So that's just something to remember, even if you are very comfortable with your bird, like what I was saying, is it just takes once where you're like, oh, come here, buddy. And then you go in there and, they read the situation different from how you're trying to have it. And you just get a big old ouch on your finger.
Yep.
And then you probably react because it's human instinct and you make a big deal out of it, maybe. And then the bird is just kind of a negative feedback loop.
Yep.
And it just keeps happening and you're like, oh God, it just came out of nowhere. Well, read the situation before you do try to. Yeah. And that's personal experience. I think I talked about it in a previous episode. And I don't think necessarily she was terrified, but Rascal. So my first experience with Rascal, our Scarlet Macaw resident, was I did that. I was an idiot. I didn't have much parrot experience at the time. I was used to like farm animals where you just kind of rough around it. So I was like, oh, Rascal. I mean, she's absolutely gorgeous. I go up to her.
And it's tricky because you see us
right. I know. And
engaging
that's
with
a
her.
whole
So
nother thing.
that's a whole nother part of it. So don't blame
Yeah.
yourself. You're not an idiot. But
well, in hindsight, not
yes,
for my
it's
sake.
hard when you're seeing her respond really well to people,
Yeah.
and then that.
I put Rascal in a situation where, and I felt bad about that part. But I put my hand right up there, and she took a big old chomp on my finger, and it didn't feel very good.
No.
But of course, that's just what I'm trying. That's the whole gist of what I'm saying is you can't just throw your hands or fingers in a parrot's face.
Absolutely.
Because most times they will be scared. They're like, oh, what the heck? This is a huge thing putting its huge hands like that are the size of me for a small bird in my face.
Yeah.
And
I think that's going back to something that maybe we could have touched on earlier too, but we'll mention it now, is we had such a long conversation about them being prey animals.
Oh,
but then
yeah, of course.
Now we need to bring it back on ourselves and remember that humans and all primates are predators.
Yeah.
Okay. It's easy to kind of remove ourselves from our predatory instincts because of our culture and the way we live now in 2024. Like, this is not how humans were living.
Yeah.
Even just a couple thousands of years ago. Like, this is so different than how we evolved. So there are so many features about a human that make us intensely predatory and intimidating to a prey animal.
Yeah.
Just our size, like you're saying, we're big in comparison to prey animals. Even Rascal, who's a full-size macaw, just side-by-side comparison, we're much larger.
Yeah.
Our hands move very quick. We have very fast reflexes. Our eyes are forward-facing.
Yeah.
Even though we don't have giant canines, like we still have teeth that bare all the time.
Big old teeth.
So there are a lot of things that maybe, again, somebody shouldn't take personal because it's just, this is the nature of a predator trying to create a relationship with a prey animal.
Right.
It's just, there's something greater happening that people should remember if they're experiencing a nip or bite. Like, there's a million other factors that could be happening just on an instinctual level that we need to not take personal.
So just kind of recalling for what I was saying about our experience, we've tried our best to narrow it down to the 4 main reasons why you could potentially get a bite. 1, terrified, which we talked a little bit about. All right. I know it seemed like a while, but it's kind of just a little bit about that. 2 is hunger. I just mentioned it. We'll dive into that. And then our 3rd and 4th, which I didn't mention yet, but it's still just as important, is our 3rd is being tired,
exhaustion,
being exhausted, overstimulated. And that's another huge one for parrots, especially in kind of a family household.
Yep.
And then lastly, which we'll talk about, is simply boredom, which we'll dive into that. So after we've been talking about all this, we've realized that we can't fit everything we want to say in just one episode because there's a lot to actually talk about with biting. So keep looking out for part 2.
Yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll break this into 2 episodes. So, because I think assessing those other 3 potential reasons why a parrot might bite are really, really important.
Yeah.
But I think for this episode, just a piece of advice that I got when I first started, and I think it feels such a huge part of how I go through my day, is I heard somebody say when I was like, I don't know, we were just talking and they're like, you know what the best way to avoid getting bit by a parrot is? And I was like, what? And they're like, don't touch it.
Well,
stop putting your hands around it and you won't get bit.
Believe it or not.
And I don't know why, like, something so basic, like, was so, like, it, like, clicked in my brain that I was like, that seems so obvious, but I had never had somebody just say it so frankly to me, like, keep your hands off of it and maybe you won't get bit anymore.
Right.
And not that I'm going to, like, say it that firmly to our
Of
customers.
course.
But I do say it to people all the time, especially if I hear people that are they're blaming the bird and they're really
Yeah.
tough on it. And they're just like, my bird's a jerk. And it's like, well, stop touching
Yeah, just leave it
it.
alone. Yeah.
And I think it's complicated because when we talked about this in earlier episodes, so hopefully everybody's listening to all the episodes
Yeah.
because they kind of all tie together.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of value in just, again, understanding that humans are complex and our social structures are so different than basically any other group of animals on the planet. So
Mhm.
we use communication in a really advanced way. So we're talking at the birds all day long and sometimes assuming they're understanding us. But I think the hardest thing for people to realize is that we as humans use touch as a sign of affection
Mhm.
all the time. We're
Yep.
conditioned for that
Yep.
from an evolutionary standpoint, but just again, in basic normal human engagement, touch is a huge component of relationships with people. And like when we first see somebody or meet somebody, it's a handshake.
Yeah.
When it's somebody you're closer with, it's a hug. I mean, there's so much that
Yeah.
is a part of our communication that has to do with touch that people, and it's not coming from a bad place.
Of
Like it's
course.
really great intention that you want to touch your parrot as a form of
Affection.
communication
Yeah.
and affection, but it has to come with a significant amount of time and patience and trust.
Right.
So it's hard sometimes, I think, for people, and even myself, just is something that I've had to learn is that even though your intention is wonderful, that you want to show it affection and give it a head scratch and hold it close and tell the bird you love it, it's not going to interpret it the way you want it to unless you
Right.
really take a long time to build the trust. So it's just not a pet that is going to provide the instant gratification of touch.
I know.
And I think it so easily can go into a sense of disappointment for bird owners. Like
Mhm.
they're disappointed by that. And it's like, well, I understand disappointment, but we don't want you to feel disappointed. Parrots are just simply not that. They're
Right.
not a touchy-feely animal. And even like the parrots that I feel I have really great relationships. Jack, who I've lived with for almost 20 years now, like every day I've seen this bird basically.
Yeah.
And the extent of our relationship is head scratches. I'm not giving him all kinds of smoochies and lovies and
Yeah.
everything, but we have a really good relationship. Now with Rascal, our resident Scarlet, like I can be a little bit more goofy with
Of course.
me and her have a lot of like confidence with one another, but absolutely that has been a result of almost now 7 years. Like
Mhm.
if you go back and look at how I was engaging with Rascal even 3 years ago, it was very different.
Yeah.
It was not as like physically engaging. It was a lot of like intellectual like companionship. Like I thought she was hysterical and goofy and she
She's
talks all the time. Like
she's so funny.
she absolutely entertains me all day long, but there wasn't a lot of physical touch. That has only come as a result of actually starting clicker training with her.
Right. Yes.
Like before, when we first started, we weren't doing a lot of like structured positive reinforcement training sessions with the resident birds. Now we are. And the result of that has been now we can touch them more comfortably and
Exactly.
confidently because we've kind of forced ourselves to be predictable. So, again, just if you're like, okay, how do I avoid getting bit? I know it sounds so simple and basic, and I'm not trying to frustrate people, but like, let's just start with like taking our hands out of the situation. Just
Yeah.
put your hands down, let the engagement be intellectual with your voice, with your smiles, with just letting the bird get used to your body being close to it and try to like be patient that like using your hands as a form of communication and affection will come with time, but if you are getting bit all the time, keep your hands away and you might see some improvement.
Right. And a lot of those come, just to reel it in,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of birds do exhibit behaviors that are indicators that they would like to be touched.
Mm-hmm.
So little Rue, our Goffin's resident, she will literally jump off of her perch from the back, like climb up to the front door, and she'll put her little head down and she'll fluff her feathers up, and she'll literally take her hand
Or her
and
foot.
scratch and her foot. Well,
I know, because she has a very hand-like
it
foot.
looks like she uses it just like our hand. So
it's crazy.
anyways, her foot, and literally scratch her head. That
Yep.
I mean, if that doesn't mean head scratches, then
I know.
I'm not a person, but but she'll let me
Mhm.
know if I've been scratching her head for too long.
Yeah.
And it's not ever like it's just she'll turn around quick and she'll put her beak on my finger. I'm like, all right,
That's enough,
that's
yeah.
me. That's on
Mhm.
me. I went too far, and I'll leave her be, and it's totally fine.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of times that people do experience the bites continuously is they, again, no judgment, but maybe they push their bird a little
Too
bit
much.
farther than
Mhm.
what the bird would like. So,
Mhm.
and what we always say is just kind of take the wins,
Mhm.
celebrate the wins, and then just don't push it, because
Yep,
then you're
and
just
not a
going to lead
positive.
yourself to maybe crashing a little bit.
Mhm.
With talking about the commitment, though,
Mhm.
we do say, especially when birds first come home, or even if you've had a bird for a very long time, like little Jack, or you've been
Mhm.
working with Rascal, we don't say, "Are you sure you want to get a bird?" It's a big commitment.
Mhm.
Oh, this is going to be a lot of work. Good luck. It's
Mhm.
more of the commitment is you can't just take the bird home and expect to do all the things we've just. That's not what we're saying. Is you have to be willing to put in
Yeah.
time and bonding with your bird in order to achieve what the main goal is when you're coming to the store and
Yeah.
picking up the bird. So that's what we mean. We don't mean you got to go home and have another day job of taking care of a bird.
Mhm.
That's not what we mean. That's just you have to be patient with parrots.
Yep.
And what you said, I've mentioned it before, and you just mentioned it now, is parrots are an intellectual companion.
Mhm.
It's not something you rough around, you
Mhm.
don't grab, or you don't squeeze or anything like
Yep.
that. It's a companion that lives with you in your space, and you enjoy their company,
Mhm.
and they maybe get to the point where they're sitting on your finger and you're talking to them and having fun, and
Mhm.
that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's just a lot of people that push the bird a little too far can experience bites, and that's
Yeah.
what I've experienced.
Getting through this conversation is like part of the reason we're so motivated to do this podcast, because there's so much nuance and there's so many things happening all at once that
Yeah.
it's hard to take a topic like biting and just pull out like, here's how not to get bit,
I
A, B,
know.
and C. But that's why it's nice to do it in this like conversational format, because it gives us an opportunity to kind of really slow it down and like help people realize like you're not alone if you're experiencing a nip or a bite. And
Yeah,
don't feel
it's
bad
true.
about it, because it's so complicated.
Yeah.
There's so many moving parts. And again, we'll have to break this into a second episode because there are other things happening. I mean, the difference, like maybe you have a bird that did experience trauma.
Mm,
Maybe you do have multiple people in the house.
yeah.
Maybe sometimes the energy of the house, and again, not coming from a place of judgment, nobody's perfect, but maybe you have a really bad day at work, or there's stressors in the household that the bird's now feeling and you want to go engage with your birds, but it's feeling all that stress. So there's so many things happening. So again, I guess the goal here is to kind of help people realize and understand like what parrots are by nature, why they're exhibiting certain behaviors in certain situations, not to take it personal if they
Right.
experience a nip or a bite, and hopefully continue to kind of be open minded as we go through these podcasts and as they're taking advice from people, to kind of realize, okay, like there is a solution to every quote unquote problem you're experiencing, but it might take a lot of kind of reflection and evaluation to figure out in your unique situation, what is the cause and effect of having these bites.
And
So,
just going along with that to kind of wrap it up is just to address one more big thing and the whole umbrella of the biting situation is like online
oh,
comments. And I guess
yeah.
I know we can really,
Yeah, it's true. We gotta
well,
say it.
it's true. I mean, and there is a lot of stuff out there that when people are researching, because they're just so excited to maybe get their very first bird or get another bird, and then they're reading everything, and then they see comments like, parrots will bite. My parrot bites me all the time. Don't get a parrot. Oh, don't get a sound conure or whatever, because they'll just bite you all the time. Well, don't take that to heart. And what
Yeah.
I'd say is, just like you were saying, there's so many situations are complex. It's not just night and day. Every bird has their own situation. Every human has their own situation. But a lot of times, what we found is maybe when the birds are not in the best environment, that's when people are experiencing so many bites.
Yeah.
And birds, as we also say, will end it on a happier note. But birds are reflections of the environment that they live in. And so if you are being proactive, if you're taking the guidance that is experience-based guidance that we're trying to convey, hopefully we can really prevent any of that behavior. And it's not just for your sake, it's for the birds. A bird doesn't want to have to bite.
Right.
Yeah, it's not what they are. It's not who they are. So avoiding putting your birds in situations to make them bite would be just better for everybody and everything.
Yeah, I guess it is hard because the online culture around parrots can be so
I know.
negative. So
There's good sides. There's excellent sides.
there are people out there that are really like they are coming and providing advice that's coming from a place of like true experience and like a result of positive reinforcement training. But if you're going online and you're seeing people talk kind of negatively, it might kind of empower you to feel, oh, it's the bird, it's not me.
That's true.
Our goal with this conversation is like to have it be positive, that as much as like it can be a result of the environment, like the non-biting or not experiencing biting is just as much of a potential as getting bit all the time.
That's true.
So as much as you might be experiencing nips or bites or feeling discouraged or frustrated, like the opposite of that is totally realistic too. You can totally get to a point where it's just a non-issue. It's something you never have to think about. It's going to take work and time and effort.
Right.
But if you feel like you're reading online, like, oh, the bird is going to be set in its ways, it's going to be really hard to get through that, it's just part of bird ownership, you might feel like discouraged or like more or less hopeless.
Then you're going into it with this mentality.
Yeah.
You're setting yourself up.
But it does not have to be hopeless.
Yeah, no.
It totally can.
Birds are product in the environment both ways. So.
Exactly. So, well, I'm excited to keep talking about this. Hopefully we've kind of reassured people not to take it personal if they're experiencing a nip or a bite. As always, people can continue to reach out and send us messages if they have specific questions or scenarios. We want to keep this podcast going. So any feedback we get or ideas we get, we'll add to our conversations. So feel free to send us an email. And then of course the little sales pitch always at the end. We love to get some feedback on the podcast because it really does help boost the amount of people that it get exposed to or recommended to our podcast. So if you can rate it or review it or share it or download it, any of those 4 things can really, really help our little growing podcast. So, well, thank you everybody for listening in. Stay tuned for the second part of, and who knows, maybe 3 parts. We don't know anymore.
It's kind of turned into a big.
But the second part of our biting episode will be coming very soon. So thanks again for listening.
As always, be kind to your parrot and he'll be kind to you.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.